Okay, so just a few remarks. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today to, as Marie-Charlotte said, unravel the puzzle in West Bengal, where the number of electric pumps has tripled, and yet it's had less effect than was anticipated on agricultural production and groundwater resources. My name's Tamara Jackson, and I work with ACR to help manage the Sustainable Development Investment Portfolio, which is a program that works across the Eastern Gangetic Plains of Bangladesh, India and Nepal, with the aim of improving food, energy and water resources management for sustainable food systems. And it's part of a bigger portfolio of work funded by the Australian government's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So just to give you a little bit of background about what ACR SDIP is, or is aiming to do, so that you can see where this project fits into a wider program of work. The ACR SDIP program goal is to maximise agriculture's contribution to sustainable food systems in the Eastern Gangetic Plains for improved food, energy and water security. So the program looks at multiple elements of the food system and works at different scales, from farm scale to regional scales. Within the program, there are different projects that all have a different focus. Some focus on promoting sustainable farming systems based on conservation agriculture to reduce food, water, energy and emissions. There are projects working at identifying effective institutional arrangements for agricultural development, exploring biophysical and socioeconomic constraints and impacts of change in agricultural systems, and synthesising the wider context of water and energy within the food system. And so the project that's presented today was commissioned to contribute a better understanding of how policy changes in the energy and groundwater sector can impact on agricultural productivity and groundwater resources. And I think importantly, it uses both macro level quantitative data as well as community level insights to explain the findings. As the largest rice and vegetable producing state in India, like most of the Eastern Gangetic Plains, West Bengal relies heavily on groundwater to support irrigation. And so understanding how different policies interact and the results of those changes is critical. And I guess given the changes that are happening rapidly in other states like Bihar, these results might be of interest more widely across the region. Particularly as the results suggest that the link between more accessible electricity and increased productivity is not as strong as anticipated, or certainly not on its own. So with that, I would like to introduce the presenters, both of whom have a wealth of experience both in irrigation and in the EGP region itself. Aditi Mukherji is a principal researcher and research group leader of climate change adaptation and resilience at the International Water Management Institute's New Delhi office. She's also a coordinating lead author of the IPCC's 6th assessment report and is today coming to us from Kolkata. And Marie-Charlotte Buisson is a researcher at the International Water Management Institute and is based in Colombo, Sri Lanka. She conducts research in development economics and environmental economics with a specialty in impact evaluation. And her work is anchored on more than 10 years of extensive field research in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia. And she's been working on West Bengal's agriculture and electrification policies since 2012. Before I hand over to them, just a couple of housekeeping rules. So we have kept this in a meeting format so that we can allow questions and comments because we thought that discussion part was really important. Please keep your microphone on mute unless you're invited to comment or ask a question. My colleague Kuhu Chatterjee will moderate the question session directly after the presentation, and we have about 20 to 25 minutes for that. So if you want to make a question or a comment, ask a question or make a comment, just put a note in the chat box, not the whole question, but just the fact that you would like to make a comment, and Kuhu will invite you to speak when there's time. And please keep your comments and questions concise so that we can get through as many as possible. And I'd now like to hand over to Marie-Charlotte to start the presentation. Thank you.
Yes, well, good morning, good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you sit in the world. So thank you for joining us today. So I will quickly jump into the presentation. And what we are doing here today is to present you your work on the impact of the electricity reforms on agriculture and on groundwater in West Bengal. To give you a rationale and a justification of why we started to work on that question. The fact is that we started to work on that question a while ago. So EMI has been involved in the groundwater sector and on the electricity energy sector in West Bengal since the year 2004, I think, and AMI research has led to changes in the groundwater and electricity policies in 2011, 2012. So I will later explain you what these reforms were. But what is important is that we know that these changes had made it easier for the farmers to access electricity for irrigation, so for electrifying their agricultural wells. So here we wonder, did this electrification of agricultural wells have any impact on agricultural and on environmental outcomes? For an explanation and a bit of a context, which I think is important, is a quick story of the agricultural growth in West Bengal. So before the 80s, we were in what we call a century-long agricultural stagnation in West Bengal with a regressive agrarian structure, and that's how Buisson explained the paradox of this hunger in a fertile land. From the 80s, we moved to another phase with a period of high growth in the agricultural sector. There is still debate of why this is coming, but what we know is that there is a land reform, there is panchayat institutional reforms, but also in the same time, we know that that's at this period that the access to private irrigation improved. And then from the year 2000, it seems that we are again in a period of stagnation. So there is a slowdown in the production of all the major crops. There is an unfavorable input-output price ratio. And then there is, again, this debate on groundwater depletion versus energy squeeze. So just to show you with the example of borrow paddy, we see these three periods. So borrow paddy is really, borrow paddy is the monsoon rice, is the dry season rice, sorry, and is at the heart of the agricultural growth story in West Bengal. So we see this long century stagnation, then the sharp increase of the production in the 80s, 90s, and again, the slowdown from the year 2000. So that's really the context in which our work is. And then comes with this reform. So there are three types of reform. For the rest of the presentation, we'll really focus on the last two reforms, but to give you the entire context, from 2007, there is a universal metering. So all the electricity run agricultural tube wells have been metered. So farmers who were before paying a flat tariff are now paying a time of the day electricity tariff. What we know from previous work and from previous evaluation is that this universal metering has changed the incentive related to the groundwater markets for selling water. Then in 2011, there is a change of the Groundwater Act. So before this change, all the farmers needed to get a permit to get an electric pump. And after that, the farmers who were in the safe blocks, so safe in terms of groundwater availability and depletion, and who have a pump of less than 5 horsepower with less than 30 cubic meter hour discharge, and those farmers in the safe block that don't need this permit anymore. So they can directly have access to an electric tube well by going to the electricity department. While the farmers who are in the critical and semi-critical blocks, they still need this permit. The second thing is the one-time assistance for the electrification of agricultural pump sets. So that's simply a subsidy. So while farmers before had to pay the entire cost of the investment, including poles, wire, transformer, etc., that's not the case anymore. And there is a subsidy when they electrify their tube well with a lump sum of 8,000 to 10,000 rupees. So these two last reforms clearly reduce the transaction costs for the farmers, but also the fixed cost to get an electric connection. And what we see in the trend of electrification clearly match with this reform. So we again see the situation before 83, where there is a very limited number of shallow tube well, and then an increase of access to private irrigation, partially through electrification, but also quite in small number in the 80s, then the stagnation. And from 2000 2010, so slightly before the reform actually, there is again an increase in the number of tube wells electrified. If we see that simply by the number of new electric pumps, I think it's even clearer why there is almost no new electric pumps before 2007. After the metering is slightly increasing, and then there is a sharp increase starting in 2011. So all in all, we consider that there is 216,000 tube wells which have been permanently electrified since 2011. So that's a huge number if we want. So why we are expecting this electrification policy to have any effect on agricultural and groundwater outcomes? I think here it's important to have in mind this theory of change, even if you maybe already know that we are not necessarily seeing this result, but that's the theory of change we had in mind. So we split the effect between the direct effects, so direct I mean on the pump owners, and indirect effect on the water buyers. And what we expect is a selling effect, because the pump owners are also selling water, so for them that's a new income. We expect a price effect, because accessing an electric pumps means that the price of irrigation for them is reduced as compared to when they were diesel pump owner or when they were water buyers. There is a timing effect, simply because accessing a pump, an electric pump, means that you have less restriction on the timing of irrigation. You can really irrigate when you need and when your crops need. And there is a quantity effect, simply because of the increase of the availability of water. So you can use more water and possibly move to more water intensive crops. And then we have the same effect on the side of the water buyers: price effect, timing effect, and quantity effect. So all in all, combining these two together, the expecting outcomes we were expecting to see is an increase in the profitability of the farms, an increase in the yield, a change in the cropping pattern, especially toward more water intensive crops, and an increase in the crop intensity. So that's from the agricultural side of the outcomes, but then on the groundwater and on the environmental outcome, that may mean an increase in the water uses. So that's really the type of framework we had in our mind when we started this work. So the work we are presenting you today is a combination of quantitative work using secondary data and qualitative work as well. The nice thing of this work is that the results on the both sides are really coinciding and just giving us a clear response, I think. So we built a block level panel with secondary data. So we have a panel with 326 blocks, and we're using 11 years from 2008 to 2019, so which means both before and after the policy changes. That was quite an intensive work to build this panel, because we combined data from different sources, which were with different institutional bodies in West Bengal. Some of these data were not necessarily digitalized, so that was again a constraint. And we have another constraint with the spatial definition of the data. So for example, the electricity data were defined at the consumer center level, which doesn't necessarily match with the administrative block level data. So well, anyway, all in all, we managed to have this panel, and that's a unique panel because that's really a combination of a source of data which, to our knowledge, have never been combined. So that's from the quantitative side. Then on the qualitative data, we conducted 28 focus group discussion with pump owners, small farmers, so including water buyers, and also women farmers. This has been done in 11 villages from 8 districts. And in total, that means that 165 farmers were consulted from September 2019 to February 2020, so very recently. So those are simply some pictures from the focus group discussion and from the field with Paddy and with maize in the field in Coach Bihar, so in the northern district of West Bengal. So now I simply want to show you some descriptive statistics really to visualize the data and to visualize the situation. So on the left side, that's again the cumulative number of electric pumps. So that's consistent with what I showed you before. But what is interesting is to move from the figure 3 to the figure 4 and to look at what's happened between the different districts. And you see that this additional number of electric pumps has really been driven by two districts, which are Pashin Medimpur and Coach Bihar, in which the number of pumps clearly followed a sharp increase from 2011. That doesn't mean that nothing is happening in the other district, but in the other district, it's an increase, but at a much slower slope than what is happening with these two main districts. So I would say simply here, just an important heterogeneity in the way the policy has been put in place in the different districts. Looking at the cropping intensity, I think you all agree that this graph sounds like a really flat or constant slope. So that's true for the cropping intensity from 2008 when we have data to 2018. That's really some sort of constant cropping intensity. We don't see any trend here. And that's true as well for the gross cropped area and for the net crop area. So looking at that and having in mind the previous slide with the sharp increase in the number of pumps, that's already to give you a flavor of the type of result that, that we'll have. Then on the cropping patterns, there is again no major change over time. So Aman paddy is really the monsoon rice, which occupy the largest area in West Bengal. Then the second one is Boro paddy, the dry season rice, which needs irrigation, but the trend is quite constant over time. What is evolving on the right side graph is somehow the pulses, which are increasing over time, which are non-irrigating crops. But on the share, nothing as compared to paddy, really on the share of the area occupied. And jute is also decreasing over time. So that's what we see. I would say no major evolution in the cropping pattern since the year 2007-8. So what we did with our panel is to conduct an econometric analysis where we have a very simple empirical model. So the idea is to have on the left side, our outcome variables is the immediate outcome, so the number of electric pump added, also the cropping patterns, so the area cultivated by for the major crops, the production, the yields, and also the groundwater outcomes, which is the depth of groundwater in the pre and in the post-monsoon. So that's what we have on the left side, that's what we want to explain. Then on the right side, our variable of interest is the treatment variable. So here we simply use a dummy, which means that all the blocks have a 0 before 2012. The policy reform is not implemented for all the blocks in 2012. And from 2012, then the policy is implemented in the safe blocks, so we use the 1, while in the semi-critical blocks, they still need the permit, they don't access to the subsidy, so we use a 0. So that's a very simple treatment variable, which means that as the block has access, yes or no, to the reform. Then the X are the control variable. We use the supply of inputs, some variable on land tenure, supply of labor, access to market, and then access to alternative sources of irrigation. And we'll estimate that model with a block level fixed effect. At the maximum, we have 326 blocks, and with time fixed effect, at the maximum, we have 11 years. So we simply estimate that with a two-way fixed effect, which in this particular case is equivalent to a difference in different estimator with more than 2 periods, because we have a panel. And here it's an intention to treat effect of the groundwater policy reform. We are also conducting some robustness check, looking at what's happened in terms of heterogeneity when we work on different subsample. We also run a regression discontinuity design, taking blocks which are just above and just below the cutoff for safe or semi-critical classification. And we also did the estimation with an average treatment effect. But all this is really consistent in the type of response that we are getting. I'm skipping, I don't want to show you some econometric table here. I think the important is that you have the message and the summary result. The immediate outcome is that we see a significant and positive effect of the policy on the addition of electric pumps. So that's not surprising. That's our 216,000 electric pumps which have been added since 2011. So that's consistent with what we were expecting in a sense. What is more interesting is to look at the agricultural outcome. And here we see a limited effect of the policy on the areas irrigated with bore, a positive effect, and with pulses, for pulses, a negative effect. But what is important is that this effect is limited in terms of the number, in terms of the areas. And this effect is not necessarily robust to different specifications, so we need to be extremely careful with that result. And we know that this effect is really driven by a small number, actually two, number of blocks. Then we don't see any significant effect on the production, and we don't see any significant effect again on the yields. So that's what's happened for the agriculture. On the environmental outcome, we see slightly a significant and negative effect of the policy on the post-monsoon water depth. So that's actually good news, because that means that the water depth is not deepening. And that's again consistent with what we have with the result we have on the agriculture. I mean, if we don't see any major change in the agriculture, that makes sense that we don't see any major effect on the use of groundwater, and that's quite a good news in a sense. So with this summary, what we can say is that at the state level, we don't see any revitalization of agriculture as a result of the groundwater policy. So then the question of interest for us was really to understand why is that the case, why we don't see this effect that we were expecting based on our theory of change. And I will just leave it there to Aditi to pursue on that and to give you some response to this puzzle.
Yes, I was muted, yes. Thanks, Mari. So this is indeed a puzzle, and given that when we did this work initially, starting from 2004, it was very apparent that the lack of electric connections and the high cost of diesel, what was preventing farmers from going ahead and cultivating boro paddy. And given that those changes happened in 2011 through the policy work that we have been doing, this result kind of comes as a surprise. But then when we dig a bit deeper, I think some other basically explanations come up. And we are going to present a series of hypotheses. These are hypotheses because none of them can be actually shown to be, can be actually proven one way or the other, because the kind of data that we had, secondary block level data, is not amenable to answering these questions fully. For most of these questions, we would be requiring primary data, something that we can hopefully do in the future. So Mari, if you can go to the next slide, please. So the first question is, the first hypothesis is poor quality electricity supply. True, we have had almost more than 200,000 new pumps added, but what if those new pumps didn't really get enough good quality electricity, and what if they weren't really running? And one of the indications was like electricity consumption. The two blocks where majority of these pumps came, Paschim Midnapur and Cooch Behar. In Cooch Behar, if you look at the terms of actual units of electricity consumed, that's very minuscule. So was it because of poor quality of electricity supply? We tried to gauge that through our qualitative fieldwork, and I see two of our co-authors, Partha Sarathi and Sujata, are here. They conducted these qualitative fieldwork, and the evidence that they brought back, and also the evidence from figure 10, which is from the West Bengal state electricity development data, it shows that actually units of consumption in electricity has gone up. And unlike most other states where this particular figure is always fudged because electricity is not metered, in West Bengal, these figures are good figures because electricity is metered, and so you're getting actual data of the millions of units of electricity consumed. So this shows that actually electricity consumption in agriculture kept rising. And our qualitative fieldwork also shows that The reason, for instance, Kuch Bihar has an overall very low consumption is because they're using really small pumps, 0.5 horsepower, 1 horsepower, 2 horsepower. And we did find some evidence in districts from, say, Murshidabad and Bankura, where farmers complained about load shedding and poor quality electricity supply. But that can't really explain much, because on the other hand, we see that, electricity consumption in agriculture is on the rise. Next slide, if you can click, Marie. Okay, the second was, it's possible, and this is what has happened. It's entirely possible that these permanent electric connections were not like bringing in new area under irrigation or anything like that. They were practically replacing diesel pumps, or they were replacing temporary connections. So before 2010, when this reform started, 2011, what was happening was, because of this huge unmet demand for electricity, this electricity department started giving a temporary connection for 105 days during the Boro season. So farmers would pay a hefty amount of money, and then they would basically they would pay a hefty amount of money to get these 3 months worth of electricity connection. And we see that after the electricity reforms, when it became easier to get permanent connection, those numbers actually came down drastically. So now nobody really goes for a temporary connection anymore, and in most districts they have even stopped this. Then the other thing that would have happened was diesel pumps got converted to electric pumps. That also has happened. This is one evidence. Again, we have unfortunately no data for number of diesel pumps, which is like no time series data on number of diesel pumps per se. But assuming that majority of the shallow tubewell in the state were diesel run, and we see that there has been a decline in number of shallow tubewells, so this kind of indirect vindication that many of these diesel pumps have most possibly got converted into electric pump. And this is something we found that our qualitative fieldwork supports this argument, for instance, and we also found that the number of the shallow tubewells, which we are assuming to be diesel tubewells, because as I said, we don't have numbers for diesel tubewell from any of these data. The number of shallow tubewells seem to have declined in the safe blocks, while they are constant in the semi-critical block. So, and our qualitative fieldwork, we have these testimonies from various farmers who used to be diesel farmers earlier and now have got these electric pumps. So that's the second explanation, that even though new electric connections came up, they were replacing something else. The third is, if you can go back one slide before, Mari. Yes. The third hypothesis, yes, no, the next one, please. Yes. The third hypothesis is that water buyers became electric pump owners. Again, in continuation, that no new irrigation was added, in the sense that people who used to buy water earlier from these electric pumps with a very high flat tariff have now become pump owners themselves, because it was easier to become a pump owner, for one, and the second was the way the tariff changed, and we can take questions on this, but basically the incentive structure for selling water changed completely, which meant that the water sellers, the pump owners, were less likely to sell water than before, which we have shown in this Meenakshi et al. Paper in 2013. That was another impact evaluation of metering. So the incentive structure for selling water changed, and in the meanwhile, it became easier to become an electric pump owner. So many of the water buyers who used to depend on others to get access to irrigation decided to, go ahead and buy an electric pump themselves. So that was the third explanation. Again, our qualitative fieldwork exactly confirms this, that a number of water buyers became electric pump owners, and for them there would be some amount of reduction in cost of irrigation, but no drastic change in cropping pattern per se. The next one. The fourth reason is that there is perhaps already a limited scope for expanding irrigated area, net sown area, and cropping intensity. West Bengal has already very high cropping intensity, though that doesn't explain why farmers would not have grown more Boro paddy, and we'll come to that in a little while. But the fact is that it is a land scarce state. Net zone area has kind of saturated. There's absolutely no chance of that increasing. If anything, urbanization, etc., would will ensure that net zone area goes down. Cropping intensity is fairly high, 190%. That means like two crops, like almost the entire state grows at least 2 crops a year, and there are parts of the state which even grow 3 crops. Net irrigated area has also remained stagnant, particularly for the reasons we pointed before, that what has happened was not addition of new area under irrigation, but mostly substitution of one form of irrigation with another. All these would have led to change in structure of groundwater markets, which unfortunately this study cannot quite capture because there is basically no secondary data from which you can capture anything about groundwater markets. These are informal markets where farmers with a pump sell water to farmers without access to pumps. And what we found was in safe blocks, area irrigated per pump has declined. This is what we found from the minor irrigation census. And also we found that our qualitative fieldwork indicates that informal water markets have shrunk. And this makes sense because our previous work has shown, and also the work that Tushar and others have done, have shown that meter tariffs are known to dampen informal water markets because of the change incentive structure. If we can go to the, yeah. So the final piece of our hypothesis is that, and we have again some indirect evidence for it, the way, if you remember Marie's, this theory of change, one of the effect was supposed to be price effect. So reduction in cost of irrigation for diesel pump owners and water buyers. But in the meanwhile, what has happened, and our report has the details, electricity tariff, which is a meter tariff, has increased by more than 2 times, has doubled in the last 10 years. But paddy prices have remained constant in real terms. So you can see, and not only electricity tariffs, but also other input costs have gone up, while the output prices remain stagnant. So this has led to reduced profit margins. So growing a crop like boro paddy with high input cost is not as profitable, say, than growing something else, which is kind of, low production, kind of low price, but maybe low input cost also. So basically overall a lack of economic incentive for farmers. So we just sum up these few hypotheses in the next slide, Marie. The puzzle, the way we kind of look at it and unravel it, new electric connections did not add a lot of new irrigation capacity. It replaced other ways of access to irrigation. The main expected benefit was through lowering of irrigation costs for water intensive crops. That perhaps happened to some extent. We don't know. We need primary data for this. But our secondary data, in the previous slide, we had this table about cost of cultivation, and we can see that cost of cultivation, terms of cost of cultivation have become much more negative than before, kind of much more, basically input costs have gone up and the output costs have remained stagnant. The third is increase in electricity tariffs and meter tariffs have meant that even if there was decline in irrigation costs, these were not realized and not passed on to water buyers. And water buyers are a substantial part of the irrigators. And at the same time, output price of boro remained constant in real terms. So this brings us back to where we started, a profit squeeze argument, that it is not profitable to grow water intensive crops like boro because of high input cost and low output prices that farmers get. But earlier we hypothesized that this profit squeeze, a big part of this profit squeeze actually came due to energy squeeze, that is not having access to electric pumps, high cost of diesel, etc. But now we see that this profit squeeze is no longer necessarily due to energy, because farmers do have access to energy, but due to other factors such as lack of procurement of paddy at the government declared prices. I'll come back to that. I have just 2 more slides to go. I'll come back to that argument in a little while. The next one, Marie. In the meanwhile, just as we were finishing up and writing our report, as you can see, the last bit of field work happened in February, and after that we had all in COVID-19 lockdown, and then Amphan super cyclone also happened, and we were able to go back to some of our farmers and ask them like telephonic interviews about what could be the possible impact of COVID-19 and Amphan. And what we found was extended lockdown has really disrupted agricultural markets. I think this is something we are finding from everywhere. I mean, especially crops like vegetables were affected. The other important part was in many villages, there has been migrants have returned. Migrants who were in various parts of India working in cities have returned, and all of a sudden villages have surplus agricultural labor. And during this Boro harvest season, which happened in the second half of April and first half of May, actually labor prices, that is labor wages, kind of went down by up to 1/3 because there was surplus agricultural labor. And you can expect the same to happen during the almond planting season, which is going on right now, and subsequently, because we are still in, I mean, this migration is reverse migration has happened. Then on top of that, we had a very devastating Amphan super cyclone. I mean, I have never seen anything like that. And my father, who is 83 years old and originally belongs to Sundarbans, he said that he has in his entire life never seen a cyclone that was as strong as this. And Sundarbans get cyclones all the time. So this was like a really one of those, and this will happen more and more frequently. This is got a clear fingerprint of climate change because the ocean temperatures were much higher than you would expect them to be. So it led to flooding. This is the work by my colleague Giriraj, who had mapped immediately after Amphan some of these inundated areas. And it also led to destruction of crops in South Bengal to some extent. But thankfully, because it happened on May 20th, almost 80 to 85% of Boro paddy was already harvested. So if it had happened just a week ago, I think the damages would have been even more devastating. So now I come to the last slide, and we do these policy recommendations. We understand that a lot of these are kind of provisional. There needs to be more understanding, more studies, but based on this particular study, we think that in the immediate aftermath, we know that these electric pumps have not provided adequate benefit. Part of the reason is very high electricity tariff. And in the context of the agrarian distress due to COVID-19 and Amphan, it calls for some amount of relief, at least for the small farmers, for at least a few years as the agricultural economy recovers. So for that specifically, we suggest a reduction in time of the day tariff and possible introduction of mixed tariff. This is something we don't know. I know Emi and Tushar were running an experiment that did not work out because of other reasons. But introduction of a mixed tariff of flat cum meter, so the component of the flat tariff. So meter tariff is very important because without it, you cannot audit electricity. And not auditing energy is a disaster. You have to audit electricity. So a component of the tariff would still be metered, but that component can be a small part. So the meter tariff can be a small part of the overall electricity bill, but the large part of the electricity bill can come from a flat high rate. And having a flat high rate can encourage farmers to sell more water. But having said that, now we have 3 times more pumps than we had in 2007 when we had flat tariff. So this is something, if this change happens, perhaps it's worthwhile to do a pilot of it and see how it actually affects people before recommending it to the government to roll it out on a larger basis. Because as I said, number of pumps have also increased, command areas have decreased. The second part, which I think is absolutely important, and there are some really good examples from other Indian states, is reform of paddy procurement system. From our qualitative fieldwork, it became clear for farmers from Kuch Bihar and all the areas which have got recently electrified, they're actually saying that they are food secure now, which they were not even 5-10 years ago. So Boro paddy is that crucial food security kind of, it was crucial for food security in the 80s, it continues to be so. And also given now there is a lot of surplus labor in agriculture and we don't know till when these COVID disruptions will go up. Paddy also absorbs a lot of labor, which none of the other crops do. So that's another reason for encouraging Boro. And then what is also a bottleneck, and our report has a bit more of that from the qualitative information, is while the government does have a provision of fair price, procurement is not so developed yet in the eastern Indian states. And there are good examples from Chhattisgarh of how this can be done. Because the way you do procurement in Indian states of Punjab and Haryana, you cannot quite do it in West Bengal, because the marketable surplus from each farmer is of smaller, because farm sizes are smaller. So you have to think of a different way of provision of procurement, maybe pooling at the village level, pooling at the panchayat level. Then finally, this kind of gels well with this argument of promoting more water intensive paddy, is also kind of gels well with the broader argument that I know ACI is also making, a lot of us have been making for a long time. I know Shilp is here. Shilp's thesis was around this virtual water. So water abundant Eastern India versus water scarce Northwestern India. Right now, India's food security comes at the expense of India's groundwater sustainability. All our food is grown in Punjab and Haryana, and they have overexploited their groundwater. But if we could align India's cropping system and move a lot of the food procurement from the eastern states, West Bengal, Bihar, Assam, etc., and then ease some of this pressure on water systems in Western India, that could perhaps lead to sustainable future. Having said that, all these have to be tested, because this study and lots of studies before us show that almost everything has an unintended impact. A good example is paddy is like, is preponing this ban on paddy transplantation in Punjab, and I know ACI also has done work on it, and how it led to enhanced air pollution in Delhi. So basically, every policy has some kind of unintended consequences. So the case we are making is for testing them a bit more rigorously, if possible, and then deploying them. So with that, thanks, and we don't have our list of acknowledgements, but none of this work would have been possible with a whole lot of people from the government of West Bengal, from all our everybody who has helped with the data entry and the data cleaning. So the full list of people who have been instrumental in this work is in this full report, and if you click on the full report, you can go and read it in detail. With that, thank you.
Thank you, Aditi. Now for a Q&A session, which I guess will go on for 20 minutes now. The first person to have asked a question is Sucharita Sen. We'll take a question from Sucharita. Sucharita, can you unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yeah. So I want to congratulate Aditi and Mari for a wonderful work. I mean, I really liked, and I thought it has proceeded very logically, and the amount of stuff which you have been able to get out of secondary data is amazing. I like the kind of hypothesis you posed. Excellent work. Having said that, I have just two questions, two short ones. One is that I'm just wondering the kind of beautifully portrayed that the three things which have happened, and you have already mentioned that the first thing is that the policy change is likely to create a disincentive for farmers who are owning the tube well to sell, because it has become metered now, which you have mentioned in Meenakshi et al.'s work. The second is that at the same time, there's likely to be incentive for the other farmers to have purchased new pumps because of the third thing which you mentioned, that is, there is a subsidy now for buying the pumps. So I'm a little puzzled as to why it has not led to new pump sets. I mean, additional new pump sets, because what okay, you have tried this hypothesis and you have kind of suggested that the older connections have kind of converted to newer temporary ones to the permanent ones, and the diesel ones to electricity ones. So I'm slightly, I don't know how to answer that. as to why it has not happened. Because so far, and this brings me to the second question, is in the almond rice, I would not, expect a great deal of effect of irrigation, given the West Bengal agroclimatic conditions, vis-a-vis say Punjab condition, where rainfall is not an interfering factor. West Bengal, you get so much of rainfall, you're likely to have lower productivity because of more water than less water in the rainy season. But that's not true of the Boro paddy, and rightly so, you have been focusing on the Boro paddy. So I'm kind of puzzled as to why farmers would not have an incentive to invest for the Boro paddy, because that is there is, the irrigation would be crucial. So there, my question is that, have you looked at the productivity of Boro after, the policy changes, whether that has changed or not? Yeah, so these are two things.
Aditi, will you like to take the question?
Yeah. So, Dr. Sen, the first is we do not know if there. I'm sure there were lots of new pump sets who were neither diesel pumps before, did not have temporary connection, nor were diesel pump owners, nor were water buyers. But our secondary data does not give us an opportunity to know who these new pump owners are. So all we have, so this would require primary work, where we go back and actually ask a lot of our previous maybe farmers, or a representative group of farmers, that did you have a pump before, or are you a first time investing in a pump? But the chances are, because everybody who grows Boro paddy would have had access to water, and that access would have come either because they were diesel pump owners, either because they were got temporary connection, or because they were buying water for somebody. So because it's not possible to grow Boro paddy, right? And on the question on almond, Marie has another paper which is in press, and there she finds very interesting thing, that irrigation has become super important for almond as well because of climate change related rainfall variability. You could have a period of almost 3 weeks without rain, and that's when not having a electric pump is kind of a difference between your crop production going down. So that kind of has also changed. I don't know if Marie wants to add. So the answer to you, ma'am, is that we don't know if these 216 can't all have been only diesel pump owners or temporary. So there would have been new people also joining this, but we don't know. Our data doesn't allow us to say who they are. Yeah, go ahead, Marie.
Yes, no, that's simply to confirm that with this work with the secondary data, we don't see any significant impact on the productivity of Boro. And I would add with the previous work we did with primary farmers data collected in 2013, we also did this not necessarily an impact evaluation, but more a comparison between electric pump owners versus diesel, and electric pump owners versus water buyer on the other side. And what we see is that there is not necessarily a difference on the yields. There isn't a difference on the value added from the farm or from Boro because of this price effect. But that doesn't mean that there is a difference on the yield. So that's what we see here, is again of confirmation of what we were already finding with primary data.
Thank you. Now Amartya Pani has asked a question which was not within the remit of the study about labor and the impact on women and men. So Amartya, would you like to come in for a few seconds and ask your question, maybe for a future research? Oh, I think we have lost him.
Kuhu, and actually we did very interesting the qualitative work that Partha and Shojata did, and they're also here. We actually found quite a bit of change happening in the last 10 years vis-a-vis female participation in workforce, and you would notice we have a section around that in our report. so that's something we didn't find earlier. So this is a new phenomena, not necessarily related with irrigation in any way, but other things like, better implementation of NREGA, more men out migrating, so that leaving a vacuum for doing things within. And I agree with Amartya's point that it's likely that this will hamper women's workforce participation. We don't know that, but I think that's a credible hypothesis worth testing.
Okay, now I will give Apurva Chaudhary from UBKV time for a question. You can unmute yourself and ask.
Thank you, Aditi and Mari, for their excellent presentation. My query is that that you mentioned that the area of the bororize is over the years it is stagnant, but you have not considered that replacement of the bororize with maize. In West Bengal, you have seen that there is a huge increase in the maize cultivation. I don't have the data, but I have the data that from 2017, the maize production was 1.5 million metric tons. And 2019, it was 2 million metric tons. Obviously, the area of the we enhanced then maize. Another thing that you mentioned that encouragement of the boro cultivation, because you mentioned that it has the ability to absorb surplus labor. But my observation is little bit different, particularly in northern districts, that if you see the Bihar and Malda, before COVID, there was huge demand of the laborers, and because of the labor scarcity, we are succeeded in farm mechanization. How will you explain these two things? And another thing is that considered the data of Malda, because Malda and Nagpur is the two potential areas where the previously the boro cultivation was there, but most of the boro cultivation areas has been replaced either by maize, or if you see that in Dinajpur and Malda, you will find the replacement with reduced tillage of mustard. The mustard areas has been increased. So have you considered all these things?
Mari, could you?
Okay, thank you, Apurva. And Aditi or Mari?
Yes, so it's there in our report, Apurva. If you go and look, we have also on the maize area. Yes, maize area has increased, production has increased, but that's the base was very low. The growth rates are very high, but that's very particular to North Bengal. And the point you are making about labor scarcity, and that is one of the reasons, perhaps while boro paddy also took a beating, it requires a lot of labor. But the main reason is that the profitability, the main argument hinges on the point that the profitability of growing boro has declined. And that's because of the low remunerative prices and high input cost, including labor. And with the post-COVID situation, I would be very interested to see what happens to all the mechanization effort that happened in North Bengal with the surplus labor coming back. How does that work? And I mean, I'm just hoping that this won't be a long-term trend, and then we would go back to some kind of normal as before. But I'll be really curious to know how that goes in the coming couple of seasons, because you would have a lot of villagers who have come back. Mari, we have some graphs. I don't know how to show it, but yes, we have considered maize in the report, and it's significant, but only for a couple of districts. And it's a good crop also, remunerative, high water consuming.
Yes,
Mari?
yes. So yes, no, maize is clearly increasing, especially in the northern district. But yes, I mean, it's really starting from small areas, and as compared to the areas with boro, it's still not comparable. And on your last point about oilseed, I mean, similarly, we have a few points on oilseed in the report. So oilseed is also increasing, but again, as compared to boro in terms of areas, it's just much slower. So that may be also why we don't see something significant, which doesn't mean that it's not happening, but that's still a small effect.
Okay, thank you, Marie. And now I'll give the Avinash Kishore has a question to ask.
Hi. Thanks a lot for the excellent report and presentation. I have more than one question. So I'll just make those points and then can. So on the methodological aspect, Mary, I looked at the graphs. You have plotted only district level graphs for very good reason. There doesn't seem to be a parallel trend even before your treatment area. You'll see the rise, the trend of in, let's say, the two north districts starts rising even before the policy change year. Maybe it's there at the block level. If it is there, then ignore this comment. Otherwise, I see a problem there from using different depth. Okay. The other points that I have is temporary to permanent switch cannot account for not seeing effect, because like Aditi, you reported, Mari, you reported, the energy use has increased almost 2 fourths or more than 2 fourths even within agriculture. So it doesn't matter. Whatever the method type of connection was, you are seeing a big jump in energy use, and that should have some effect. Similarly, water buyers turning into pump owners and that leading to not having enough sales of pumps, that also I think is, will have only a small effect. Why? Because West Bengal has almost what, 1.7 crore land ownership owners, and you have cumulative graph. Your graph shows the cumulative number of electric pump owners is 0.3. If you add all the diesel pump owners that were there in the last census, and let's assume that these all electric are new guys and no switch, which is clearly wrong. Even when you have only 0.7 million pumps, diesel plus electric, and you have 17 million land holdings, all of whom irrigate, right? So there is still a lot of people who are buying water. What I think the primary survey would reveal is what happened to the terms of water markets. And the problem in West Bengal is that they are very complex compared to, let's say, Bihar, etc. Hourly rate, there are not so many hourly rates. So you can't use CACP data, etc., to understand how those terms change. And I think that's why a primary survey would be really important to understand childcare, what's going on. The other point, I don't think meter tariff can explain the problem unless there is something major behavioral going on. Two reasons. One is, even at current West Bengal tariff rates, and I'm taking non-peak first, you are 1/3 the cost of diesel. A diesel pump costs 20 rupees per unit of energy. Electric pump cost in West Bengal in peak hours is 7-8 rupees. Non-peak hours is 3. I think one piece of secondary data, if you can collect, is since time of day metering, is what is the hourly use of energy in agriculture. My sense would be that in peak hours it won't be that high unless power supply is really bad. That's only when farmers would use electricity during peak. So that is the secondary data that you can collect and check. What's the energy used during the time of the 7 rupees per unit versus the rest of the price. I don't think even that explains the simple cost benefit. So yeah, those are my points. I think it's a really interesting puzzle as to why it's not getting any of the desirable effects that one would have hoped, or we hoped at least when we talked about it.
Thanks, Avinash. I think we give time for
Aditi
to respond.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Avinash, for your good comments. Well, on the parallel trend, the parallel trends graphs were there in the presentation up to this morning. I just removed that few minutes before the presentation, so I just invite you to go to the report to see that. It's quite good because we clearly see the parallel trends for all outcomes, agricultural and groundwater. So there is a parallel trend before 2011. That's true in the safe and semi-critical blocks, and that's partially the case after, but not for all the outcomes. So, so we did that. On the fact that there is still a lot of buying, and in the proportion, I quite agree. Yes, that's why we are interesting to better understand the water market and maybe go again for field work here and primary data collection to better understand what's happened on the water market side. I'm sure Aditi can add on to that, but that's something we cannot necessarily do with the secondary data we are using here, and yes, we can check. I don't know if we'll have the information, but in theory they should have the information on what tariff is used and when the electricity is actually consumed between the three, I think, type of tariff. We can check it. Yeah, Aditi, if you have more.
I don't think
No,
she
I think it remains a puzzle, and for me, hello, yeah. So two things. Can you hear me? It shows my internet is unstable. So very briefly, I think it is a puzzle that requires, I think, additional work. Two things to me seem important. The very low, if you see one of the tables that shows cost of cultivation, and you would see that the ratio between profit versus cost of cultivation has kind of, declined significantly, showing there's been a, the point that we make about constant price of paddy versus increasing input prices. I think that's one big important explanatory variable. And then the other part is changed incentive structure due to metering. It's just that the price of water would have gone up, and these again would require empirical data, which our secondary data doesn't allow, but it tells us that a part of the puzzle is not yet explained.
Okay, thank you, Aditi. And I think we just have time for one quick question, and that will be to Jay Ananda. Jay? Jay, are you there? Jay Ananda? Are you muted? He doesn't seem to be there. His question was to have an understanding of the level of groundwater extracted during pre and post policy. It's an interesting question. Do we have any idea?
No change. If anything, water levels have come up in some of the blocks, and there's more of it information in our report. There's an entire section on groundwater. He might have a look, and we also have here Otishman. He might add, Mari might add, but basically no change, and that's expected because, if anything, our expectation was that there would be more water extraction given there would be more water intensive crops, but that didn't happen. So we don't really see any discernible change in water levels. If anything, water levels have come up in the post-monsoon season.
Yes.
And we haven't controlled for rainfall. That's one of our missing pieces of data, actually. We haven't controlled for rainfall, so yeah.
Okay.
Yes, to take his question very precisely, he's talking about the groundwater extracted. Actually, we don't know the groundwater extracted. We don't have the data for that. What we know is that the groundwater availability, the depth of groundwater, is not deepening after the reform.
Okay, thank you. That was the last question, I'm afraid, because we have a fixed amount of time, and I will now hand over to Tamara to say a few words of thanks.
Okay, thank you, Kuhu. Thanks everyone for your great questions and for joining us today. I think it's a really interesting discussion, and obviously it's kind of just the start, maybe not the end. Definitely seems like there's some better and deeper understanding needed, and particularly in terms of water markets and around those. And I think it's a good example of, not being able to make policies in isolation and, understanding the unintended consequences of those. So I just want to make it, let everyone know that we have been recording this webinar also, and it'll be available on our website. So that's www.acrsdip.com. We'll put it on next week. And thank you a lot to Aditi and Marie-Charlotte for your time today, and a really interesting report and presentation. Thank you so much.